Thrilled to be here. Thrilled to welcome you all as well. I think with the common theme this morning of boardroom expectations quickly shifting from experimentation to outcomes, right? Very, very interested to pick all of your brains and to dig in on what you're seeing. But maybe before we even get into that, quick round of intros, your backgrounds, companies you've worked for, the boards you're on, and why you're here. Dave, we'll start with you.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. Dave Barter, I guess by maybe Silicon Valley standards, probably a little bit different of a background. I spent my first 20 years in large cap, so I was with General Electric in the 90s, and then I was with the Boston Consulting Group and Microsoft, and came down here about a dozen years ago, and that was my entree into mid-cap software, and most recently I was the CFO over at New Relic, which we sold, gosh, about a year ago. And so it's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. Anna?
I'm so excited to be here and just looking out, too. So, hello, everyone. I'm Anna Pinzuk. I have done a lot of different things, have been a Chief Development Officer at Anaplan. Used to be a GM and run a P&L at HPE, an $8 billion business. Worked at Cisco, worked at Veritas, and most recently was the COO at an AI robotics startup. I'm now I'm called Plural, so I'm mostly on boards, and I sit on 3 public company boards, Aptiv, SentinelOne, and SmartRent, 1 private board called CVTS, a university board, Cornell, and then several nonprofits. So I've seen sort of the AI picture across a lot of different types of businesses, and I'm super excited to be here.
Well, thank you, Anna. Hello, good morning. My name is Joe Ellenson. After 21 amazing years at Salesforce, I retired back in August. I was, when I joined in 2003, I was employee 380. And certainly was involved with 2/3 of that duration as the chief accounting officer and controller. Living a little bit of semi-retirement life. I shared this story with these folks the other day that a couple of months ago, my wife approached me and said, you seem to be always really busy, but you're not earning a regular paycheck. So what exactly are you doing? And certainly the working with boards has been fun. I grew up here in San Francisco, so this is very native to me. And apologize to all of you if you're not getting much natural light because of the Salesforce Tower blocking the sun. Sorry about that. So.
I think they're getting plenty of light coming off of our domes here,
there you
Joe, as the book ends. So you've all worked for industry titans, 100 billion plus type behemoths. You've all had exposure to much smaller companies that are, on the front lines of AI transformation. I think to start, maybe at the macro level, and we'll work our way down, but when executives are coming to you presenting AI initiatives, right, what are you looking for initially? Like that strategic alignment, that vision setting. What differentiates the good discussions from the bad? Dave, we'll start with you.
When I think about the conversations, I think for me, it actually starts to probably get informed by what are we thinking about strategically from the company perspective. And for me, I guess I kind of anchor it from the lens of what are we thinking about from customer value and product? How do we think about it from operations? And certainly from this lens and this audience, I also think about it from a support lens. And so for me, it's where are we kind of tethering the discussion, in terms of our value pillars. Then I would say, I also think about it relative to the maturity of what we're doing. And so some of our AI initiatives have elements where it's citizen development. Some of it is very specific where we have it's anchored either into, again, product operations or something else where we're thinking about our processes. So I really look for just where does it sit within the frame that we've already discussed, either with a board or in just within the CAO, CFO. How does it sit within what we've already discussed with an audit committee?
Anna, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, for me, it varies a little bit in terms of the type of board that we're dealing with. So there are some boards where you're looking at transformation, and you're trying to figure out from, what does AI actually bring to the business, and what's the level of impact that AI can have. I think there's some other boards where people are still learning, and I think, by the way, board members are learning as well. And so I think there's an opportunity to think about experiments. How do we actually start, with AI, and then learn a little bit, and then figure out, okay, where can this take us? I think about 4 things from a board perspective. One tends to be AI for products. The second one is AI for experience. What does that do? So AI agents or AI interviewer, things like that. There's an effectiveness element, which I think impacts a lot of this audience in terms of cost reduction. And I think the majority of what boards are thinking about now tend to be focused on the, bending the G&A curve, and what does that do? And lastly, risk. How do we leverage AI to improve our risk, our resilience, our posture, and at the same time make sure that we don't introduce additional risk. So those are the 4 things that I see my boards think about.
Got it. And then, Joe, I guess from your perspective as well, you saw a lot of change in 2 decades at Salesforce, what they were, what they're becoming, always on the front end of adopting these new waves. When
Salesforce was never shy on jumping in big.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, like the balance of how do we get started, right? Do we start small? Do we go, like Andrew had alluded to, these big, massive transformations? I did a decade at SAP, right? I've seen a lot of those that went very well. I've seen a lot of those that went very bad, right? But the trade-offs and the balance of those quick wins and building momentum versus kind of the wholesale change, how did you guys approach things?
Well, I'll share with you that it's been very valuable to have grown up in this area. I think by just all the different tech companies that are here in the history of Silicon Valley, there's just a different attitude, a mentality, a confidence level, and I think that's why a lot of the companies around here jump in big. And it's not just AI. If you think about the past couple decades, it doesn't feel very long ago to me that I was dealing with something called the internet. And how is this going to transform my accounting organization? And how do you start? Those were a lot of the topics here. And I think, I think in general, it is, as Anna pointed out, organizational specifics, as Dave was talking about, what are we trying to do as a business? And a lot of it to me came down to a question that you have to ask each organization with AI is, are we ready as an organization? Are we ready for the future? And if you don't have a lot of clarity on that, that is a lot of conversation that I as a board member have had with people. And that's about, do we have the right infrastructure? Change management, change exploration, just even that. You start going down these paths, and I think that's where you find your speed as to which is the most comfortable way. Because at the end of the day, we're not looking for a losing situation. We want successes. We need the successes. The business case needs it, and we got to go.
Maybe, and sticking with you too, Joe, because I think you've got a unique perspective. Two decades on the audit committee at Salesforce, right? Typically, risk is the foundational theme in those discussions, right? To your point, maturity, readiness, crawl, walk, run, all of that, right? As the AI wave's been adopted, how did you guys think about it from a risk perspective, right? And what were you expecting from finance leadership when you were working through it?
Well, first of all, when you started a company which had, my first year, 176 million, and now Salesforce is doing 40 billion, you believe in anything, like we can do this. And I think there's a huge point to that conversation is because there's an element of confidence, there's an ability to say, we can do this together. But you're right, back up to the audit committee, it's really a lot about risk, but I think so many of the committees today, including the audit committee, is geared around, yes, a question on risk and how to manage risk so we don't find ourselves in trouble, compliance with laws and regulations, the annual reporting, all of that. But I really think the biggest question the audit committee is always trying to address is with management is, how are we going to get from here to there? And you're seeing that conversation role-playing many times. For those of you who are true accountants, you know that there's sustainability reporting. That's a whole conversation of how are we going to do this? And I think that's kind of the appetite and the conversations that people have. And it's a very transparent and open dialogue here. But it's built upon a relationships and faith and confidence and the ability to have this deep conversation with each other.
Anna, maybe back to you, right? I think our conversation's leading in, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing everything from $20 billion, tier one automotive, AI forward provider that's dealing with tariffs, that's dealing with changes in labor rates in Mexico, very big macro themes that are touching tens of thousands of employees, all the way down to AI for all, right?
Yeah.
And where and how do we educate the new wave, coming out of school that can be ready for what this looks like. Thoughts from you, right, on what you're seeing there, especially if I dial it into finance in particular, right? We've been talking G&A. What are you seeing from the disparity of those boards and maybe the additional scrutiny when pointing AI at finance versus kind of the early waves of R&D, CX, call center operations, those types of things?
One thing that I'm seeing, and at least on the boards that I sit on Aptiv, which is an AI forward, I think, company, we still have a lot of work to do to deal with change in the environment. Aptiv is dealing with tariffs. We're dealing with wage rate differences. We're dealing with a whole bunch of elements that are impacting our P&L, right? And so I think companies like that are looking to AI to figure out how can we really deal with this level of change much more quickly. Part of that has to do with really understanding if you're a $21 billion company and you've got to shift your supply chain or things like that, right? Part of that is understanding the as-is processes, right? How do I actually do this much quicker than before? I don't know about you, but what used to be a quarterly sort of earnings view, to me, has shifted significantly inside of companies, and even a weekly view of what's going on, and weekly controls almost is changing a lot. So I'm seeing those changes at large companies. At smaller companies, if I look at something like SmartRent, we're looking at setting up processes in some cases, right? And trying to figure out how to leverage AI to do something better than what we did before. Sometimes we don't have SOX controls or things, or our contracts might not be as pristine. Part of what we need to do is understand what's in our contracts, for example, to then figure out what to do with them. So I think the use of AI will vary a little bit by the size of the company. I would also say that every company needs to be thinking about AI now. If you're there's no board that I'm on that doesn't say, what are we doing, from an AI perspective? And I think it's a great opportunity for CFOs and CAOs that have traditionally been thought of as really more risk-oriented, to really put a foot forward in terms of how do I leverage this new innovation, right, to take us to the next transformation, the next level.
Maybe to that end, I think, Dave, you'd be a great one to ask this too, just from your, you've worked in large companies, you worked for C3, so you're on the front waves of pushing AI adoption in your Tom Siebel years. Your view on ultimately how you balance that, to Anna's point, right? There's a lot of different functional domains that are coming to the table. I think a lot of companies are trying to figure out how do we not, repeat the sins of the past with application sprawl where there's AI for everything, and we're starting to see more and more kind of emergence from IT groups starting to lean into this as well. When you've been in prior CFO roles or even with some of the boards you're sitting on now, that balancing act of functional expertise from the line of business coupled with kind of the know-how for enterprise scale coming from IT, how do you guys balance that? How do you work as peers to start to stratify and prioritize what you're tackling in what order?
I think it's a great question, and a prior AC chair, she'd start a conversation off with a very thought-provoking question, and she would say, how many spreadsheets do you have across all of your key business processes? And the question would always compel you to say, if you think about something like sales commissions, okay, well, we touch Salesforce, but as we unpack our processes, we'd find out all of these spreadsheets that were counted by various stakeholders to say, okay, how do we do what we do? And that actually started to inform, I think to Anna's point, risk, operational strategy, and it would really compel us to actually start to formulate a plan that says, if I'm a $1 billion company and I'm competing against a $5 billion or a $10 billion company, yes, I want to bend the G&A curve, but I want to bend it in a way that I'm getting great operational efficiency. I also look at it, and I would say some great board members always aligned with, how do I create a great employee experience where they're really, I think, again, you think about the advent of the internet. I really want to be an AI native company to say, gosh, I have really the best jobs available to folks where they're acquiring a very contemporary skill set. So the prioritization, I think, for us would really go into the idea of, I want to blow up all of these spreadsheets, ad hoc routines that always seem to kind of percolate through the SOX testing, or they seem to, well, if it's sales commissions, what starts to percolate up when AEs are starting to give feedback on the process?
It's taxes. It's the tax group that has a lot of spreadsheets.
I was going to say,
The tax provision always has.
Yeah, there's a fiefdom over there. But it's interesting you talk about the spreadsheets too, because our tagline was brilliance in the basics, right? And spreadsheets are not that. We all know the woes of it. I think it was I always make this joke that it was a plot by Microsoft to make their number every year, to keep us all hooked on Excel. But I think the conversation starts sometimes like, how does this stuff get funded? You know, when you do have the idea here. And I don't know what successes you have seen on the funding side. Like, the thing I've always hated, and this was proposed when I was there at Salesforce, was to create this AI think tank budget.
the slush fund, the AI
And
slush fund.
I think that's a direction, personally, I think it's a direction to nowhere. Because I don't know who owns that budget and how those funds are being actually used for the greatest return on investment. I've always felt that there's a concept of integrated thinking, and if everything's integrated, and everything for Salesforce, from decision-making, budget allocations, just every decision is integrated into a line of business. And so I've always argued, let's expand their budgets and let those line leaders, what is good for their business? And have you seen that? Have you seen both? Or?
I can give you at least my example. I've seen both, and sometimes I think it's necessary to have like a startup fund, meaning a jumpstart fund, you know, that says, hey, I'm going to have a pool of money, and then I'm going to allocate it to a set of like, experiments in effect with AI, and then try to see like which ones of those really blossom. And then at the time that they blossom, what I've seen is that people in the business, to your point, start to really embrace them. And now you have pull from a business unit or something like that, and then they go and do it, right? In smaller companies, I've also seen where people say, hey, it's really hard for me to sort of invest in this AI thing when I've got this other stuff to do, you know? And so I think it tends to be a little bit of a balance. One thing that helps, and I've seen a trend on boards, is that in addition to the audit committee, now on boards we're seeing the advent of the technology committee. Sometimes it's tech and cyber committee. And sometimes when companies have a tech committee, they are able to have the conversation about funding, or to be a place where you can come and say, okay, we've got these really great opportunities in accounting, so they actually come to the tech committee and make some proposals for investments, and we do that. I'm just forming a tech committee on one of my boards, and the idea is to figure out how to look at AI across the business overall. G&A tends to be a place to start because of cost, really. But then those projects are going into the tech committee, which used to be mostly like IT related, right? So it's sort of an interesting, I think, shift.
Yeah,
Like
I
infrastructure.
was
Yeah.
gonna maybe unpack that a little bit more, right? You buy technology either to, accelerate top line, take cost out, or mitigate risk.
Yes.
Right. I think a lot of people started with the low-hanging, easy fruit, right? LLMs are really good with text, so naturally, call center operations, right?
Right.
And prescriptive next best action tended to be a wave that we were seeing, aggressively adopted. Numbers is a different game, right? And with everybody in this room, right? For the most part, everybody loves granularity. They love detail.
I
right?
do.
I know you do, Joe.
I love detail.
That balancing act, right? Of okay, driving top line, improving bottom line, especially with this macro environment where EBITDA margin and positive free cash flow are being rewarded, like the Shopify, wave that Andrew showed. Where are you guys seeing kind of the loudest voice in the room as far as who is taking the biggest chunk of that discretionary budget that you alluded to get started, and maybe some tips on how can finance be more vocal to stick their necks out for bigger results faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andrew was right in that a lot of the initial innovation went to things like Cursor and other AI tools for the product side. But I'm seeing a shift now. In this environment, I see two things happening. One is certainly there's a G&A push, primarily because a lot of companies also don't know what the impact of the macro situation is, right? So we need to look at costs and make sure that our situation is good. I think the other element that I'm seeing is sort of business-driven focus on a set of KPIs that are important. Growth being really, really important. And so I see a lot around sales, things like budgeting and forecasting and things that can really enable the top line. So I'm seeing a shift from the product side of AI more to kind of sales and finance in combination. Customer success or customer support or those things, put those aside because they were sort of early use cases. But I think this is the time for finance. I think there's an opportunity for finance together with sales to really come together and really look at top line and bottom line impact and drive those, and really demand that the people on the board support those efforts.
Joe, you had started to allude to the maturity curve, right?
Yeah.
Folks very comfortable with the day in the life of Excel that are now being asked to understand big data, understand SQL. All of that tech-enabled wave of what this next frontier of a knowledge worker looks like. Are there any things that you were seeing that gave you pause or made you concerned on, hey, how do we upskill? How do we get kind of this new wave of talent operating at the 15x that Andrew initially had alluded to?
I'll start off with one of the challenges I think finance has is finance is not really a line of business per se. And finance is at the center of the enterprise. You could say that about other G&A organizations too, like HR and IT. But we're called upon numerous times to support corporate initiatives or a line of business initiative. And those take over prioritization. And so then we end up with, what about us? And we have all the staff members who supported the business during the week are now working on our finance initiatives on the weekend. So I think that starts a conversation right away. And all of us are talking about a common problem that is very intensive for AI and all the data elements, and that is really data. And there are so many conversations about data and what data we're trying to get and to fuel us and accelerate us. But I would say for finance, at some point, people have to be selfish. There's no other way to do it. But we can't, in my mind, launch with the big initiative that competes with the corporate initiative. That's what an enterprise, an ERP application would do to you if you've ever done one of those. Those take up a few years, by the way, and tie you down to quite a bit. But I think that for finance, I'll go back to the presentations this morning with Nichelle. I was here back in September, not this particular venue, but at One Sansom, when Clarity was here, and it was the first time he pitched the architect offering. And I go, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Where was that product when I was the chief accounting officer? And part of the reason I say this is because so many of our organizations are built with teams who are there to support us all collectively. Transformation teams would be one example. Internal audit organizations, Sarbanes-Oxley teams, they're resourced. And so how do you take the power and ignite all of them? And to me, it was everything that Nichelle had in his slides, was that whole time to get that process end-to-end documented. And of course, if something's going to take 4 to 6 months to get done, you're not going to get my attention immediately. But if you're telling me that this thing's coming to me next week, that kind of breeds upon it. And I think that's how you get the flywheel going.
Yep.
I'll also say this, and I don't think too many people who have this experience, unless you've been a chief accounting officer, like I see my friend Sue over there. I felt like at Salesforce, I was interviewing for my job every day. When you start off at a company that's 176 million and you're running to 40 billion, there's a different type of person that sits in the saddle of a chief accounting officer and controller. And so every day I felt like I was re-interviewing for my job with the board, the senior leadership team, and one of the things I always needed was I needed a win. I needed something that was specific to us that could get all the other executives to go, oh my God, what is that guy doing? And we were talking about that the other day, those stories where we're building relationships with other senior executives. But if we had something for ourselves to show our own people that this is real, we just move together. And I think I just throw a few of those types of thoughts out there.
I think, I really like what you've said. And so one is because you're personalizing it to what it can do in terms of showing an impact almost every day, right? I think the other thing from a board perspective is that if you think before the internet, you think that in order to get anything done, you would have to wait to the next day, business hours, and get things done, et cetera. But I think what something like Clarity can do for us is really speed up how we deal with change. And things like controls can be part of that. If I'm a board member, part of what I think about is, are we sampling risk, or are we looking at risk on a continuous basis? Is there a way to do that? And I think with capabilities like this, there's an opportunity to really strengthen and deepen the level of scrutiny as well as insight that we can have to do things much more often, much more regularly. I think it then allows CAOs, right, to have those wins, because you actually have insight and data that you can share with board members.
Yeah, there is no goal line on transformation, right? You're
No, it's a
continuously trying to
continuous
get better.
process, right?
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think maybe if you're thinking about it from the board perspective, I think the board appreciates that this is a generational shift. It is a step function shift in technology, just as impactful as the internet, just as impactful as mobile devices. And I think where Joe is going, you almost have to have the confidence that you can transform and you can have the confidence to elevate. And there was a CEO I was talking to not too long ago, and he kind of echoed Anna's point of the first wave was product, and I certainly saw that in DevSecOps, where product was dramatically transforming very quickly. What really blew him away, he actually asked everyone and their personal goals as they launched the fiscal year, tell me how AI will change your job. And after the first fiscal quarter, he did a pulse. He said the best projects were coming actually out of the G&A teams across legal, HR, finance. They were transforming more quickly than anybody else. And I think that really came down to the idea, almost again, that great audit committee question. How many spreadsheets, how many bespoke things, how can you start to use a new technology to transform your job? Yeah. And so it's not a big ERP project. Frequently, this is, almost, there's a company I know that's using almost the Six Sigma framework. How do you break apart all your processes and do targeted fixes that have very high ROIs, and you get after it very quickly, and they have payback periods that are well less than a year frequently, kind of what we saw earlier.
Justifiable results, repeatable plays, right? Build that winning culture, and to your point, the flywheel effect.
I was always looking for projects specifically for finance that were practical, specific, targeted.
Right.
Some days I tried to avoid IT. There were some days, learned that's probably not a smart move long term. And definitely do not forget about the security teams. When they start seeing applications and data moving outside the firewalls and into that back and forth, you don't want that phone call.
I think you're bringing up a good point around AI being a team sport also, right? Because you can go do some experiments and do things sort of just to see and prove out areas. But at some point, you're going to get caught by the net of privacy and risk management and what's happening with my data and cyber, right? And so I do think you need to make friends, with your CISOs, with your IT professionals and business leaders, right? And for a board, I think the board wants you to come in to present your your business case, let's say, for AI, and do it as a team. Because I, as a board member, will say, okay, well, it's great that you're doing that, but I don't know, have you implemented the AI risk management framework? And, and what are you doing there, right? So I think it's very helpful, to think about it. You can go in and do your own thing for a while, by the way. I'm not saying always, ask somebody, but I think a board will want to see this being sponsored, throughout the company.
Yeah, the old adage of to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together.
Yeah.
That's because they also have budget too.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
It's like
Panhandle.
the old adage of their budget is better than ours, to use that. So.
Well, I know we've got about 7 to 10 minutes left. I wanted to make sure you guys aren't just listening to me ask questions. I think there's three mic runners. It's hard to see from up here.
I
But
know.
are there any questions for the board from the audience? Anything you guys would be interested in asking Joe or Anna or Dave? Show of hands. Right here.
I probably don't need a mic. I'll say it loudly. Good to see you again, Joe. Those that know me, I work in Salesforce, reported through to Joe for quite some time in my early years, but I wanted to talk about risk with the adoption of AI. Maybe more so maybe less AI, just new technology. I feel like generally our bias is to assume that the new technology needs to be near perfect, or the error rate that we would expect from it is much higher than we would expect for the human that performs the same process. And so oftentimes when we're justifying the adoption of a new technology, or for a lot of us justifying it to our auditors, they might say, how are you comfortable offloading this work to an automation when it was done by humans before?
So I'll share with you what I think sometimes on these topics, because unfortunately the enterprise software vendors don't have the full thing. If I could, I would have standardized everything with one vendor, but that's not the way the world works. And so the questions that I was always asking about the product that we were evaluating is how ready is it? And the question I was really trying to figure out is, am I going to be their code developer, or am I going to be their customer? And I didn't have a lot of time to be someone's code developer to help build it out to suit my needs. And so I started off with that first question, and then you go from there.
So I think there are three types of risks that I'm looking at right now. And one element is the fidelity of the output. And that's kind of one element of risk that I look at, and that's why I'd say I start to unpack the problem almost in that Six Sigma framework of figuring out where AI is germane and relevant. But the other elements of risk that I'd say I think are specific to the function, but also specific to the board are how much, and this is something a CISO, we were part of a discussion several weeks ago. They're finding enterprise applications are turning on AI to fine-tune, train, or a variety of adjectives that are coming in, but your data is now starting to feed in, and these are branded products. And so kind of going into it's a team sport, figuring out how to work with your CISO to make sure not only do you have the right application, but the right engagement with your tooling platform to make sure your data stays your data, I think is a key part. The third dimension of risk that's actually starting to emerge on some of the AI stuff is AI engines that are training on other AI data. It's not training on original data. And so that's the other element of AI starting to enrich itself on information. And so I think understanding your tooling platform to say, how accurate is it for this use case? How accurate and safe is my data? And then how good is the platform, longer term, where it's enriching on the right data? I think are the dimensions that I would study.
And I would say auditors have to get with the program a little bit too. Meaning, and if there's auditors in here, there's a balance, right? Because the companies that don't leverage AI will fall behind, is my view. So what I'm seeing in our boards is that we're working together with the audit firms, and actually they have a great opportunity to have AI practices and AI training sessions and things like that. So I'm seeing them come into the boardroom. And actually, I've been invited I've been to PwC and why, lots of sessions to figure out how to get that right balance with your auditors. And frankly, the fact that NIST has come out with AI, the risk management framework, is a great way to start to get educated on, they have like govern, map, measure, and manage as 4 principles of risk management. And so that's the way that you can start to talk to an auditor and say, look, this is what industries are doing. We're deploying things, we're comparing it to humans. Sometimes you start with that, side by side, and then here's how we're managing risk.
Great insights and great question. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
So a question that I have, and I was particularly struck by the sort of back and forth between Anna and Joe about whether companies have AI center of excellence or whether AI budgets are embedded in with the functional leaders. And at the board level, is the topic of conversation overall we need AI digital transformation, or is the topic of conversation here are sort of the key pieces of key places in the business where we need to get more leverage, and AI is sort of an obvious place where we need to experiment and get more leverage?
I could tell you on my boards that, look, boards really care about the metrics for the business, right? So you start out with kind of where are we going as a business and sort of long-term KPIs, that's where you go. And then within that, we look for the management to have a conversation with the management team to say, look, we don't want to be left out of the AI opportunity, both from a product, sort of what does it do for us from a business perspective, and then what does it do for us, from a effectiveness, efficiency, et cetera. So I see boards talk about sort of what can it do for the top line, what can it do from a cost savings perspective, what can it do from an experience perspective, and how do we manage risk better. And then within that context, then we look for the management team to make recommendations. And actually, every board, like right now, there's an urgency on boards. By the way, sometimes boards have a person, maybe like me, who's more tech oriented, and sometimes you don't have that on a board, right? And so on both of those kinds of boards, I'm seeing an urgency of, okay, what do we do with this AI thing? And in the context of the long-term strategy of the company, how do we bring this in? And it's interesting, I think now there's blueprints. I see so there's an association called the NACD, which is focused on corporate directors, and they're coming out with blueprints of how do boards start to think about AI, and where to start. But that should come from the management team mostly. As a board member, what do I do? Sorry for the long answer, but I'll come in and I'll say, okay, here's areas where I've seen this work at other companies for, revenue recognition, for contract, sort of looking through all of our contracts and pricing, for, forecasting, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a little bit of how it works. I'm glad to talk later if it's helpful.
Yeah, you've got plenty of opinions.
Yes.
I think we've got time for one more question. I'm getting the red flashing light here telling me to shut up, but one more.
Interesting discussion. Are we asking the right questions? And one of the examples I heard this morning was the document that used to take 30 hours can now take 30 minutes. How about why do we need the document? Is it possible to abstract away the process to AI LLMs? You just don't need the process because all the answers are an interaction away. Let me take 10 more seconds. Most organizations are organized around functions, marketing, finance, product, and et cetera. But now we have a technology that understands everything. We humans tend to specialize in one thing, and that creates silos in the organization. So is it possible to break all the silos and abstract the process away and have organizations that are AI enabled with no silos and no process?
So it's a great question. I think you're going in the direction of agentic and what are we really expecting for in the future state processes. I think whether you take it from a board perspective or you take it from maybe an officer perspective who's presenting to a board an approach, I think you are breaking down those processes to figure out where do you start to drop in the AI that starts to eliminate certain documents or it automates some elements of the workflow. I probably haven't seen an agentic solution that I think fully automates it where it eliminates everything. But I think you're kind of going in the future state direction. And so I guess almost similar to past waves, I think you're taking AI for what it offers today, but planning for how do you continue to phase in and get the full value as the technology continues to mature.
Yeah, I would say I like where you're going, but I would imagine that most boards first want to see sort of the explainability, the traceability, the transparency of how AI works first. We sort of need to get comfortable that before you get rid of processes and ask anything of AI, you need to build responsible AI that you trust first. So I think we're going to start out with a set of experiments still in functional areas and maybe across functional areas to start out with, and think about what you can do when time and resources are so available to you, because I don't think we've had that conversation yet as a board. And so if I take the analogy to development, we're now developing features in hours and giving them out in hours, right? Well, what's the equivalent of that for the non-development work? And I think that's where we would start instead, and then eventually get to a world where, okay, here's the possibility of like really asking the AI almost to own the operational fabric, which you're saying, of a company.
Joe, do you want to jump in on the AC risk perspective on this?
I think, first of all, I just would say this is why I love technology, right? This is exactly why, because when I think of, Dave mentioned agentic AI, Salesforce, this time last year, Salesforce was talking about what is now referred to as Agentforce. It was just 12 months ago. And thousands of sales have occurred. And so this is endless as to where we're going to go. But I think the part that's most important is we have to take people along this journey together. And there's too many stakeholders to work through right now. We've got investors, we've got regulators. You know, you start off with this, like, we have to all move together, and it's going to take some time. But I don't think people will lose the dream, you know. But it starts off with, what are we trying to do? And what is the best thing for us to, is it the customer experience? Is it the employee experience? What are we trying to solve? And that will guide each business.
I think that's a great ending line, right? Transformation starts with mindset at the end of the day, right? The tooling and the operationalization of that follows. So with that, we're going to break for a morning break. I want to thank our panelists for the lively discussion this morning.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience for the engagement as well.